As fears of a possible trade war between China and America escalate, I'll be asking what lies behind the latest sanctions that the United States has imposed on China, and what is the likely fallout from such a move. And as China promotes President Xi Jinping's vision of a shared future for mankind, how will China advance such an idea while others concentrate on pushing their own interests first? Welcome to The Point. I'm Jonathan Betts, sitting in for Liu Xin. China has released a list of potential tariffs on $3 billion worth of American goods, from pork to fruit to wine, that it could impose in retaliation for new U.S. trade sanctions. President Donald Trump this week hit China with tariffs on up to $60 billion of imports. It's all fueling fears of a trade war between the world's two largest economies. China's embassy in Washington described the move as self-defeating, saying it will hurt Americans and global markets. So what is behind this trade spat, and what are the risks, not just to the U.S., but to China as well and the world? Joining me now to discuss all this here in Beijing is Tim Stratford, managing partner of the international law firm Covington and Burling's Beijing office. And from Hong Kong, we have Victor Gao, global counselor in the Asia Society. Great to have you both with us. We appreciate it. So, Tim, let's start with you. What do you think is driving this decision by Trump?
I think that there has been a lot of concern in the United States and, frankly, in some other countries about some of the practices that China has employed since they joined the WTO. To be candid, a lot of people feel that China's economic development model has evolved differently than we expected when China joined the WTO, that it's not exactly a market economy, but more of a kind of a hybrid state capitalism, and that as a result of this, the government is using various policies that have put foreign companies in kind of a unbalanced position. And so, frankly, I think that whoever had been elected president of the United States, whether it had been Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, we would see the United States taking a new approach to the relationship with China. So we're not surprised that this is happening. We wouldn't have predicted exactly the exact parameters of what's going on, but I think it was pretty predictable that the U.S. would be doing something to change the dynamic.
So, Victor, do you agree here? I mean, these complaints have been around for a long time from the United States that China does not play fair when it comes to its trade practices, that it forces companies to share technology, its secrets for access to the market. Does Trump have a point?
I disagree. I think indeed there are differences between China and the United States, and the Chinese system of doing businesses, or socialist or political system or economic system, are very different from that of the United States, and we never expect that China will become another United States. And for those problems existing in China-US trade, which involves huge volume up to about $600 billion every year, indeed there are problems. There is a huge imbalance, and we need to do the right thing to address these issues head along. What the United States is doing, using domestic law to impose huge tariffs on Chinese exports to the United States, is the wrong thing to do, and is a violation of the WTO regulations. And China will be left with no other choice but to retaliate. Eventually, both the United States and China will suffer from the consequences. China did not initiate this. This round of trade war is started by the United States, and the world is a witness to this.
But Victor, to Tim's point, that these complaints have been around for a long time and that China has not taken them seriously, what do you say to that?
Well, there are problems, and I think the best way is to sit down and talk with each other rather than using unilateral measures to impose sanctions or tariffs, and mainly because this round of tariffs will trigger the retaliation from China. Eventually, the consumers in the United States will suffer, jobs will be lost in the United States, and China will suffer too. So it's the wrong thing to do for the United States to do this, and it sets a bad example for the rest of the world. And we are, in a sense, already in the middle of this war, and we do not know when this will end.
Yeah, so Tim, I mean, let's get your response to that this is raising real concerns that this could lead to a global crisis here, and that there are no real winners when it comes to a trade war.
I agree with part of what Victor's saying. I do agree that this is taking the relationship to a new level. I think the most significant thing about this action is that it is a message being sent by the United States that they are no longer content with the other methods that they've used to try to deal with the issues over the last 17 years since China joined the WTO. We've had dialogues, and there's a feeling in the United States and, frankly, in Europe and other countries that the dialogues have been used in part to sort of prolong what's going on rather than to really address the deeper problems. So the United States is saying enough is enough and we need to do something differently. I agree that this is a difficult measure. I agree that it could cause pain to both sides. And frankly, that's what we really need to think about now. By the U.S. taking this step, probably economic harm will be inflicted on China and also on the United States as well.
Do you think it's a necessary step that must be taken?
Well, I think there might be a number of different ways to do it, but the fact is that this is what the administration has decided, so now we have to figure out how we're going to deal with it. And my concern, which maybe is addressing Victor's point in another way, is we're entering into a dark tunnel. The U.S. will demonstrate that it can inflict some injury on China's economy. China will demonstrate the same thing back to the United States, and so
you're saying it's necessary that we enter this dark tunnel.
I'm saying that we have entered the dark tunnel, and what I'm concerned about is how we're going to get out. So that's the real challenge, is what is it going to take for us to stop fighting with each other. The problem that the U.S. has is that there are fundamental differences between the way the Chinese economy is operating and the way the U.S. economy is operating. And because China is doing this, our trade doesn't work in the way that the WTO intended. So how are we going to deal with that? There are two things the United States can do. One, they can take measures just to try to protect their own industries and their own employees and so on. That's one approach. That's not optimum. But on the other hand, for China to make some changes to their own system when they think their own system is working very well is going to be difficult as well. So I am concerned that we're entering into a tunnel, and it's going to take quite a bit of effort on both sides to figure out what the light's going to look like at the end of the tunnel.
So, Victor, what do you think China will do to try to get the country, the United States, the world, out of this tunnel? What's next?
I think whatever trade grievances the United States has, bring it to the WTO for a fair hearing and negotiation and resolve whatever differences there are. China will never become another United States. The fantasy of expecting China to become another United States in terms of the identical political structure is really indulged in fantasy. China has followed its own path, and China will be different from the United States. That doesn't mean that China violates the WTO rules. Therefore, if there is a problem in trade, bring it to the WTO, and that's the only right decision. If you resort to unilateral means of trade tariffs, for example, China will be left with no other choice but to retaliate against the United States. And you're talking about the two largest economies in the world resorting to tit-for-tat struggle against each other, inflicting damages to each other, and neither China nor the United States will come out of that as a net winner. Both will be losers, and there will be hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in the United States. Similar situation may happen in China, and we will head on and face the problem as it is and deal with that. No one in Washington should expect that China will buckle because of the tariffs to be imposed on China.
So, Tim, we hear this argument a lot, especially in China, that, listen, there is a global system set up to handle these kinds of disputes. It's the World Trade Organization. It was largely created by the United States. Why is the U.S. not making a formal complaint to the WTO then?
In January, the U.S. government and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office issued a report where they concluded that it was a mistake for the United States to support China's entry into the WTO on the terms that were agreed at the time. That's a pretty stark conclusion. It was stunning to many of us. But in addition to coming to that conclusion, the U.S. concluded that the WTO tools in and of themselves are not adequate to deal with the imbalances and the distortion in global trading patterns that are caused by the Chinese system. And so as a result of that, the United States has designed that, in fact, the WTO and the global trading system is at risk unless there's a way found to deal with some of the practices of China which are viewed as abusive.
So, Victor, I want to get your response to another concern that I have, which is what China may do next. I want to go back to that point because I have some information here I want to repeat to you, that some of America's best-known brands, Apple, Boeing, Intel could get hit badly from a trade war. Then in recent years, Beijing's announced deals worth tens of billions of dollars to sell airplanes to China. China buys close to $13 billion worth of soybeans from the United States. 7% of Apple's sales are in the Chinese mainland. So who has the most to lose here between the United States and China if this trade war escalates?
Yeah, President Donald Trump signed this document triggering the process of imposing these sanctions on China, and the Chinese government also announced its sanctions against the U.S. imported goods. But this Chinese round of announcements is not actually, as far as I understand, the direct response to what President Donald Trump signed yesterday. This was actually in direct response to the last announcement signed by President Donald Trump for steel and aluminum tariffs. Therefore, I think while the Chinese sanctions against U.S. imported goods is relatively small, 3 billion versus, let's say, 50 to 60 billion imposed by the United States, I think the next round of Chinese announcement, which will be addressed directly to this latest round of sanctions announced by President Donald Trump yesterday, will be much larger and much more consequential to the United States economy.
So
and we
Victor,
are talking about, for example, agricultural products, soybeans, cotton, grains, etc. You can name it. And then probably moving to other products, including Boeing airplanes and many other things.
So
there are other possibilities that China can think about.
Well, hold on, let me interrupt you there, Victor, because that's an interesting point, because I hear the counter-argument that China deliberately is going to have a very muted response because it does not want to escalate this. It wants to encourage dialogue. It wants to encourage a deal. You say that's not likely?
A dialogue is always better. Negotiations are always better. But when you are faced with this round of punitive tariffs, for example, in violation of the WTO framework, then China will be left with no other choice. China has to stand firm to defend its legitimate interest and retaliate back to the United States. I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry said so. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce already expressed its view. Lots of people and experts and people in positions of power in Beijing already very fully and eloquently expressed this point. So the United States need to wake up and see how many jobs will be lost in the United States if they continue to do this unilateral way of sanction against China. China will retaliate. That's the message I heard very clearly from Beijing.
Without question, they're clear about that. So let me give the last word to Tim as we wrap up quickly here.
I think the United States understands that China has this capability. We listed American companies that sell their products to China. China has a massive trade surplus with the United States, so we can also think about how this is going to affect the other side. But I think the point of the U.S. government action is not to be punitive. It's to say, here in this 301 report is a list of problems that we have been raising with China for over a decade. We have not seen meaningful practice at all. Therefore, something has to be done differently. This is being done by the U.S. to get the attention of the Chinese government. And I do hope, as Victor says, that there'll be a discussion. But the U.S. had to say the previous discussions were not successful, and we have to approach them with a different mindset.
Well, it is a heated debate. A lot of jobs are at risk, and billions of dollars are as well. All right, Timothy Stratford, managing partner of international law firm Covington and Burling's Beijing office. From Hong Kong, our friend Victor Gao, global counselor in the HS Society. Thank you both for your time. We appreciate it. And you are watching The Point. We'll be back after a very short break. Welcome back. Chinese President Xi Jinping discussed his vision of building a community of shared future for all mankind at the closing meeting of China's 13th National People's Congress. The concept was first proposed in the report of the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party of China back in November of 2012. At this year's two sessions, the top legislature enshrined it in the country's constitution. Internationally, Xi's idea has been widely received. Last year, the UN Security Council incorporated it into a resolution for the first time. And in January, the Davos summit set the theme, creating a shared future in a fractured world, echoing Xi's tone from his landmark speech last year in Switzerland. So why is Beijing focused on building a shared future while others are pushing a nation-first message? And how will China advance that idea? Joining us for today's discussion is Qinduo, a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution, and Edward Lehman, managing director of Lee Xu LLP, that is a Beijing-based law firm. It is great to have you both on set with us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So, Qinduo, let me start with you. Building a community of shared future for mankind. What does that mean?
Well, it means basically like in this globalized world, the interests of the nation, the welfare of the peoples from different countries are intertwined, closely intertwined and interdependent on each other. What happened to one group of people could affect the welfare of another group of people. Somehow we have to deal with either the will or woe of the world. We need to work together. A good example would be climate change issue that will affect everybody around the world. So we have to somehow work together for the benefits of our own or for the benefit of the future generations. I think that's the idea generally for the mankind shared future here.
So, Edward, why do you think China has adopted this theme now?
Well, it's been something that's been kicking around for some time. So, up until the run-up to the 2008 Olympics, there was this, world dream and this that they were promoting, then it became the China dream. Now we're back to the world dream. And when you look at it statistically, this is 1/5 of humanity. They have 100 million people traveling around the world, influencing economics around the world. This is a large consumer market, and growing. This will be the largest economy very quickly. And so I think that they're taking on the mantle of leadership, and they're saying, we have moved under the greatest economic transformation in the history of the world, and now is our time to show some leadership in their own particular style.
But why is that mantle so important to China?
I think that they had suffered, throughout history. As in a lot of plight and a lot of problems, and that now finally, when Mao Zedong said, on October 1st, 1949, Chinese people have stood up. They had stood up there, but this is really standing up, and this is really becoming part of the global community and taking a leadership role. And you haven't really seen it from any Asian country actually in the world taking a real leadership role, because the collective society and because of, generally speaking, in Asian cultures. And so you've seen it with Western culture, but not so much with Asian.
But Qinduo, with that role, with that responsibility also comes a lot of criticism, a lot of fear. We hear the concerns that China is a rising power, exerting its influence, threatening others. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not surprised with those criticisms and suspicion and question. I would say, some of the suspicion and concern are legitimate, but probably from a lack of understanding or difficult to understand the Chinese culture, Chinese idea. Look, global media has been mostly in English and also covering the United States, the only superpower, right? But only recently, the media turned their attention to China. But a good example would be this week, actually, at the conclusion of the NPC, National People's Congress, President Xi Jinping gave a speech. He talked about, like, in the past, the Chinese people worked together and, fought the bloody war and to build the new nation, new republic. But it was translated in the completely wrong way in one very important Australian outlet and also another very important news agency around the world. They say China will fight a bloody war for its due place in the world. You see why the concern is over there, but I think there's a language skills, there's a proper coverage of China, a proper understanding of China.
So why is there that disconnect? Why is, especially for something as basic as that, that is indicative of a larger issue, I would say. Why?
I think partly because China's rise has been so rapid. For a lot of people, it's out of expectation. If you look at the observers about China, they say there's a lot of prediction of China collapse, a lot of theories. Oh, well, as the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, the theories collapsed themselves, right? So people try to make predictions about China to try to read the Chinese mind, but somehow it takes probably more work.
Edward, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, especially because you do business here as a Westerner.
I think that that there is there's total miscommunication, and if you look at history, so there's General Joe Stilwell, right? He he was on the ground here, and he could speak Chinese language. This is during the Second World War, and he gave reports back to Franklin Roosevelt. This is what we should do. This is the direction we should go in. And of course, we didn't listen at all to him, the guy on the ground. I mean, so there's a disconnect, and the disconnect is trying to explain back to different countries that are looking at it through a different lens. So, for example, we're constitutional driven, we're common law driven. We know when the Supreme Court makes a decision that gay people can marry, then it's automatic. Here it's a civil law system. It moves much slower. It's based on the German Code of 1896. And so I think our lenses are just completely different. And just to follow on what was said about last week, so for example, our friends at National Public Radio, the guy gave this question in Chinese language, a Western guy, and it was very telling because he first said it because he didn't trust the translators. Okay, then he said it in English. And it was interesting, but the fellow from the National People's Congress, they said, do you want us to translate what he said in English? He said, no, I didn't understand his Chinese, but I'm going to respond to his English. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that there's this disconnect. They were focusing on term limits. This is not what happened last week was momentous, and what we're talking about right now is part of that, and it is a real huge seismic shift, and I think the Western press missed it.
Well, and what I wonder is if this is, like I said, this is indicative of maybe a bigger disconnect, but whether this disconnect also is kind of making it difficult for China to share what it's learning, to try to share its power, to share its growth with other countries.
Well, not necessarily. Can I just add one more point on the last question? Basically, there's also this ideological difference, right? China is not a Western-style democratic system. China is kind of like a unique, its own style in terms of governance, in terms of its culture and tradition. So, still some people would adhere to this, people used to like a Cold War mentality based on the differences of ideology. So that's one part, why they find it so hard to understand China or to accept the rise of China. And when it comes to the China sharing this dream or this idea with other countries, I don't think it's a big problem. It depends on what are the countries that you are going to sell this message. If you look at the developing countries, a lot of them are signing up to this Chinese idea, Belt and Road initiative, which is actually a practice of this shared future idea.
It's a huge landmark project behind this idea. I mean, it's really a driving force.
That's right. Previously the idea is really about connect Asia to East Africa to European continent over there. But now you can see, African countries and Latin American countries are signing up to this idea. Of course, they welcome investment from China to build a better infrastructure and also more trade, more investment, and more jobs.
So how do you, Edward, compare this to the American First philosophy pushed by Donald Trump? I mean, these are two very conflicting ideas from the world's two largest economies.
No, absolutely. I mean, it couldn't be more diametrically opposed, and I think that China is filling this gap because they're saying we don't want to be global. Well, America can never really say that, but there's a retraction on globalist and free trade and those kinds of things, especially with what you talked about in the last segment. But I think that this is something that is really wise and that needs to be done. The One Belt, One Road initiative, by the way, is fueled by the AIIB, the Asian International Infrastructure Bank, and as was said, is that you've got all of the major countries except for United States, Japan, Mexico, and one other that I remember, can't remember right now, but have signed up on it, and they've actually funded the bank, which is going to help fund One Belt, One Road. So it's kind of brilliant, really, and it's the new Marshall Plan. I mean, that's not the right terminology. It's more like, but it's set in a win-win philosophy and a mutually beneficial philosophy that they're actually going to bring prosperity along.
Do you subscribe to that?
I do. I mean, I understand that there is a demand for the party and for the country to be able to keep the economic at 6.5, and you've got to find it can't be just domestically, so it's got to go outward, and so that's what I think is driving that. But I think will there be beneficiaries, ancillary benefits to that? from these other countries for sure.
So what do you think are the drawbacks then, Qinduo, to this, really instead of America first, really a global first approach that China is taking?
Well, I think this is, we are living at this critical juncture, basically, with the rise of populism and also protectionism in some developed countries, including the U.S., unfortunately, the only superpower over there. But the idea of a shared future, I think, obviously, is widely accepted by the majority of the international community. As you mentioned in the introduction, it is incorporated with the UN resolution, and also you can find its trace in this year's Davos Forum, right? Like a shared future in a fractured world. So this idea do represent, I think, the will, the idea of the majority of the people. Like somehow we should help each other deal with the challenges together. And we are facing the difficult.
Is it a reasonable goal, though? Because some people argue that there's always going to be winners and losers in the global system.
Yeah, a good point. You see, like a globalization. That's why you would ask question why people are somehow fed up with this globalization in some countries, like in Britain, European countries.
United States.
Because it's not inclusive, because it's unbalanced. Elite group of people benefited hugely from globalization, the process, but some people are lagging behind. They say, oh, I'm fed up with this globalization. Sorry, I'm losing my jobs, I'm losing my benefits. So that's why if you take a closer look at the idea of a shared future, President Xi basically make it very clear that is like it should be a balanced globalization. It should be inclusive. Everybody should be included.
And Edward, is that possible?
Well, you have to have goals, and a vision. And that's, at least I applaud this idea of let's put it out there. Let's, let's be like Babe Ruth and say we're going to knock it out of the park and this is the direction we're going to go in, as opposed to, something else which would be closing and trying to, move backwards and look just for the Chinese nation. So is it possible? Yes. I think you first have to identify a goal, and then what's interesting is that they've outlined how to get there, and so we'll see what happens.
There's a very clear vision. We'll see indeed. Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you guys so much for your time. Edward Lehman and Xu Qinduo, Senior Researcher at the Pangoal Institution. Edward Lehman, also with Managing Director of Lee Xu LLP, Beijing-based law firm. Thank you guys so much for that. Well, that will do it for this edition of The Point. We thank you so much for watching. Download the app called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or you can go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day and a great weekend.